You are listening to the second segment of our two-part series, The History and Medicinal Benefits of Chocolate, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio. Hello, Susan. Welcome back to Time Monk Radio.
Oh, I'm so glad to be back with you. And let's see, where were we? We were talking about chocolate.
We were talking a lot about chocolate.
And I was saying that I loved chocolate. And that to me, chocolate is like a food group. So important. And I can hardly imagine a world without chocolate. I remember one of my apprentices who was very disappointed and upset with me because she said that I made her chocolate taste bad. I said, what? She said, well, first of all, I didn't know that you were a chocolate fan and that the apprentices would be allowed to eat chocolate. I said, not just allowed, I buy each apprentice group like a 5-kilo bar of dark chocolate. Right, so it's really like, here's your chocolate, enjoy. She said, so I, brought commercial chocolate with me, and you were asking about this, right? So she had brought 2 one-pound bags of some kind of, I'm not going to mention, the brand name, but some kind of commercial chocolate candy stuff with her. And she had been eating it, right along, She'd go up to her tent at the end of the day, and she'd have some of her chocolate, yum, yum, yum. And she said after eating the food here and having the good dark chocolate and drinking nourishing herbal infusions, that when she opened the second bag of her, let's face it, junky chocolate, she couldn't stand the smell of it, and she couldn't even get it to her mouth. So I do not find this an unusual story, that people find that as they have things that taste good and are good for them, that their taste, in fact, becomes more refined and that they want those things. Now, I do not, however, serve my apprentices chocolate as was served to Cortez in 1528. Here is the recipe for it was probably a drink that they served him. And we're going to guess that there were a whole lot of other people drinking it too, okay? 700 grams of cacao. That's 1.3 pounds of cocoa. 750 grams of sugar. That's a pound and a half of sugar, right? 56 grams or about 2 ounces of cinnamon. And I probably didn't use cinnamon Mesoamerica in 1528, but they have a plant that tastes a lot like cinnamon. So in the modern iteration of the recipe, cinnamon is used. It's quite a bit, 2 ounces of cinnamon. 14 Mexican peppercorns, 14 grams, that's about half an ounce of spice cloves, and again, that's a particular plant of Mesoamerica, and you can use regular cloves to substitute. 3 vanilla pods, 1 handful of anise, and it was listed as anise in the original recipe, and there are those that think it's probably a tahiti, like probably a kind of marigold. 1 hazelnut. I wonder what a nut is doing. Add musk, gray amber, and orange blossom water. Wow. Other beverages that were made in Mesoamerica included beverages with the cacao flowers, which actually come from a related plant, not from Theobroma. And even today, these flowers are used to prepare a drink that is thought to have important healing properties. Generally speaking, even in Mesoamerica, cacao was a vehicle for administering other plants, but especially psychoactive plants and fungi. Now, you remember last week, we were talking about the young women at the Southeast Women's Herbal Conference who were making their herbal preparations with chocolate. So they're mixing the cocoa powder and the herbs together, getting the herbs in their mortar and pestle and grinding them up and mixing them up with the cocoa powder and then melting that in and making bonbons out of it. None of them were putting any kind of hallucinogenic plants in with their chocolate. And I was rather glad of that, because in our culture nowadays, we don't like young people doing that. But believe me, back in the 16th, 17th centuries and earlier in Mesoamerica, people of all ages who were allowed were using psychoactive plants. And certainly the priestly caste was doing that. In Switzerland nowadays, there is still a chocolate made with powdered psilocybin mushrooms, or at least so it is said among those who are interested both in mind-altering plants and in chocolate, and in the connection between mind-altering plants and chocolate, because that was one of the things we were talking about last week, wasn't it? We were saying that chocolate does things to the brain, that it has direct and specific effects on the brain. And there are chemicals in the chocolate that actually do that. There's one chemical called PEA in the chocolate, and when we consume chocolate, the PEA triggers the brain to release endorphins, right? And it also augments the dopamine that is already in the brain. Now, both endorphins and dopamine are used to heighten sexual pleasure. So we've been running along a theme of chocolate is really good for the heart, and chocolate is an aphrodisiac. And it's not an aphrodisiac in the way that sometimes we joke about aphrodisiacs as focusing on the genitals. No, it's an aphrodisiac that focuses on the brain. Again, remember that quote from last week, the brain on chocolate is the brain in love. We're not talking about an aphrodisiac that turns one into a menace on the street corner. We're talking about an aphrodisiac that makes you love yourself and love the people that you're with. Remember we talked about Casanova and the Emperor Montezuma, too, who is said to have had hundreds of wives, and so the story goes, they were all happy because of chocolate. Of course, the inference there is that the chocolate made him so potent that he kept them all happy, but I think that probably the more blatant reading is right. They were all happy because he probably let them eat chocolate as well. When we consume chocolate, the serotonin level in our brain goes up, and there is a special compound made in our brains when we eat chocolate, and it's called anandamide. Now, as soon as I read that, I started laughing because my brother's name is Satananda Das. And the Ananda means bliss, and here is anandamide, basically meaning the chemical of bliss or the chemical of euphoria. So this is not just a kind of, chocolate is so good, and so that's why it's about love. No, there's actual things that go on in our brain and our nervous system when we are eating chocolate. All right, Goethe used art to kind of move himself out of his, what some people call a depressive German attitude, a different society and a different mindset, and he was one of the ones who really made a cult of chocolate and said, avoid coffee. Balzac, right, drank coffee, but Goethe drank chocolate. What an interesting thing, huh? The dichotomy was very great, right? Marx was against chocolate. Ah, we know which side of our bread our chocolate is on, don't we? The essence of chocolate is languid. In Mesoamerica, I mentioned that women generally were not allowed to consume chocolate. There was an exception, and that exception was, yes, indeed, those they were about to rip the living hearts out of. That's the coffee would make them feel calmer, but there was another exception, too, and that is prostitutes. All those priests with their coffee beans, which they were bleeding on and then giving as sacrifices, well, they also used those coffee beans to pay prostitutes. We actually have written evidence that this was one of the things that they used coffee beans for. Pretty amazing. So let's go over this again, because I think this is interesting and very important. Chocolate heightens the ability of our nervous system to take in sensory information. When we have consumed chocolate, we actually feel better in our bodies, and things that are happening tend to feel better to us, and if they don't, we have the energy and the wherewithal to change it. If the music's too loud or it's too grating, we change it for something that's better. Chocolate strengthens the nervous system so that it is energized and ready to go, but restores a calm rhythm to the nervous system. So rather than being we're in that rather zen space, like the Aikido master, who's completely relaxed, completely calm, but watch out, because she'll kick you right between the eyes if it's needed. Energetic calm. At the same time, in our brain, serotonin, the feel-good hormone, is being made. You know, those drugs that people take when they're feeling depressed, they're serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Let's break that down. What is that? Serotonin, brain chemical, makes you feel really good. Serotonin is produced by the brain, and then it is taken up by certain cells in the brain, so more can be produced, right? So that's called reuptake. And then these drugs inhibit the reuptake of serotonin, which means that there is more serotonin in the brain. So more serotonin means a happier attitude and less depression. Go for a walk and eat a chocolate bar when you feel depressed. In addition, we are augmenting dopamine and endorphins. And dopamine, of course, is used as a drug for people with Parkinson's disease, but for those who don't have Parkinson's disease, when there is plenty of dopamine in the brain, then the brain says, how about we have some sexual pleasure too? And the dopamine then enhances that sexual pleasure. Endorphins, like serotonin, are the hormones of pleasure. As a matter of fact, I did a 3-year program with Gene Houston, and when we graduated from that program, we were asked to make some kind of commitment to the community of humans at large on the entire planet. And my commitment was to raise the endorphin level as much as I possibly could. So when we are laughing, our endorphin levels are high. It's one of the reasons why people who laugh have a different experience of pain. You may remember some years back, a professional comic, Art Buchwald, was diagnosed with terminal kidney problem and was sent to hospice and was told, literally that he had just a few weeks left to live. And he rented funny movies, he told jokes, he laughed all the time. He actually lived for more than 2 years, he laughed his way to another 2 years of health. And if chocolate is what is going to get you to laugh, well then, why not? And don't forget the anandamide, the bliss chemical. Chocolate itself directly causes bliss and euphoria. Remember, we said that throughout Mesoamerica, chocolate was used ritually, and I mentioned that it was used as a ritual offering, but it was also burned in rituals as an incense. And I think, oh, I wonder what that would smell like. Would it smell like chocolate? I don't know. And it was used as an inebriant. So, again, there was the sense that you drink chocolate and you get blissed out, and then you come to the ceremony. Among the prehistoric Toltec, a branch from the chocolate tree was placed in the hand of every person who made a public offering to the gods as a sign of the gods' thank you and respect. Ah, indeed. What else can we say about chocolate? Well, there is lots of legend and lore, of course, about chocolate. In rural villages throughout Mesoamerica, you will still find chocolate being produced. It's a very interesting small shrub or a tree. And the chocolate flower is produced directly on the branches of the tree itself. Like we're used to seeing flowers kind of coming out from the ends of things, or like the flowers, like apple blossoms being in the clusters of leaves. But the chocolate flowers are just directly right on the branch and the trunk of the tree. And it grows only in tropical areas. And it can be flowering year-round, so you can see flowers and fruits at the same time. The flower, when it's fertilized, develops into a kind of long, oval pod, which is the cocoa pod. And when I was in Costa Rica and we were at a cocoa farm there, they took a machete and they harvested one of those cocoa pods for us and split it open, and it was what they called green. In other words, the seeds inside, which are the chocolate, weren't mature. But the stuff between the outer casing and the seeds was edible, and they allowed us to eat it. I don't even know how to describe it. It was almost like cotton candy, but it was just a little denser in texture, and it tasted like chocolate. So it was this white, fluffy, nice-in-your-mouth, chocolatey stuff. Whoa! I noticed some piles of boards laying about, and I asked what they were for, and our guide smiled and walked over to the board and lifted up one of them, and in between the boards were cocoa beans, and they were fermenting. I'm not going to go through all of the steps here for you, but it is a long, long journey from the cacao tree and that little flower to the cocoa bar, the chocolate bar that you hold in your hand. Starting with the harvesting of the pods, the splitting open of the pods, and the removal of the seeds, which is the part that's going to be the chocolate, from within this lovely white pulpy material. Those seeds then have to be fermented. And once they're fermented, then dried. And when they are dried, then they are ground up. Now, the chocolate that I bought there at that chocolate farm was pretty much just that. It was the fermented cocoa beans which had been ground up and sugar added to it. And it was very interesting. The texture was quite unlike the chocolate that I am used to. I'm used to chocolate with a very smooth texture. but the texture of this chocolate was granular, quite granular. And when I ask about it, they say, well, yes, usually what happens is the cocoa beans go off someplace after they've been dried, and they are treated, and they go through actually a lot of different treatments. And part of the treatment involves removing the cocoa butter from the beans so that you then have the chocolate separate from the cocoa butter. And the cocoa butter is then added back to the chocolate in greater proportion to make that smooth chocolate that we're so used to. But if you do that in a tropical place, well, you know what happens when chocolate gets hot, right?
Yes.
It melts. And that's the cocoa butter melting. So the kind of, farm-style chocolate that they make in the tropics doesn't have extra cocoa butter. But none of the cocoa butter was taken out of it. I'm not saying that there's less fat in it. It's still more than half fat. The cocoa beans themselves, like most beans, they're very rich in fats. And many times when people who know about foods and foodstuffs, when they kind of get, oh my gosh, that chocolate comes from a bean, it comes from a seed, they say things like, well, that explains it. That, totally helps me to understand what's going on with chocolate and how it is that it can be so healthy for you. You think about it like, oh, well, it's not like, eating something bad. It's actually eating a whole food. It's actually, like eating beans. It's something that helps our bodies. And it has all of these antioxidants because that's what seeds need, right? Seeds need to have antioxidants because they're going to be going about the business of growing. And as they are growing, they need antioxidants to protect them. So getting that image of, oh, the chocolate is actually coming from beans really helps to understand. Cacao trees can live for up to 60 years. And the flowers can be a whole bunch of different colors, including violet. A single tree produces approximately 100,000 flowers, which can mature into cocoa pods every single year. And so far as we know, cacao trees have been cultivated for at least 4,000 years. Did I mention that theobroma means food of the gods? Thea is God, and broma is food, food of the gods. The Aztecs used the cacao beans not just as food, not just as medicine, but also as currency. And they were thought of to be a direct psychoactive. The fresh fruit pulp, what I was just talking about eating, was brewed into a beer. I can imagine that must have been a really, really good tasting beer. And that was considered a sacred psychoactive. The beans themselves, either taken directly or mixed with sugar or other psychoactive plants, were highly regarded as a way to bring one closer to the gods and to help one understand what it was that the gods wanted. In ancient records in Nicaragua, we find that the farmers of the cacao trees are required to abstain from sex for 13 days before they plant cacao seeds. Why should they do this? Because if they have sex, they will make the god of chocolate angry. Oh my goodness, can you imagine that the god of chocolate is jealous of human beings because we not only have chocolate, we have sex too? Well, even the gods think that there is something as good as chocolate. Now, speaking of hot chocolate, which we have mentioned right along as we've been talking about chocolate, much of the hot chocolate that we get is chocolate that has been Dutched or alkalinized. And you mentioned a maker of chocolate before, Hershey's too. And Hershey's has been of late saying, oh, eat chocolate, it's very rich in antioxidants. And apparently someone has taken Hershey's to task about this and said, oh, but Hershey's, you alkalinize your chocolate. And this is also called Dutching the chocolate. And what it does is it makes the chocolate dissolve instantly into milk. You know how you just take a spoonful of like the hot chocolate mix and put it into the milk? And that alkalinization apparently counteracts the antioxidant value of the chocolate, the polyphenols, and a lot of these other compounds that we have been talking about. So I'm interested to see where this, I think there might even be a lawsuit against Hershey's for saying that their chocolate is rich in antioxidants because they're claiming that the process, the Dutching process or the alkalinizing process. You know, I remember that when my mom used to make hot chocolate for us, it was kind of a tricky thing, and she would kind of melt the chocolate powder and the sugar together and then add milk bit by bit by bit. And I'm thinking, oh, wow, that wasn't Dutch, that wasn't alkalinized, and I bet you could go to the supermarket even today and find that kind of chocolate. So to wrap up, because once again, we have had such a good time thinking about chocolate and talking about chocolate that we've come just about to the end of our time. We want to say that the primary health benefits from chocolate come not from drinking hot chocolate, but from eating chocolate bars. And the more chocolate in the chocolate bar, the more of the polyphenols, the more of the antioxidants we are going to get from that. Some people say, oh, well, but, you know, there's sugar in that chocolate. It's true. There is, but you know, there are 70% bars, 80% bars, and even 85% bars. So there's not a lot of sugar in those, and sugar, it goes ever so nicely with the chocolate. I'm really not afraid of a little bit of white sugar here and there in the diet. Granted, I've seen the studies. It can be addictive. When you give mice sugar water, they can get quite addicted to it. But I wonder, what kind of diet are those mice giving? I always say that there's room for a little sugar and a lot of chocolate in any diet that is a good, broad-based diet, and especially the diet of people who are drinking nourishing herbal infusions. And let me set the record straight here. Of course I drink hot chocolate. I have a granddaughter, and she has friends. And in the wintertime when we're outside sledding and doing things, when we come in, I fix them a nice cup of organic hot chocolate, and it's probably been alkalinized. But they're little girls, so I'm not really terribly worried about the antioxidants that they get from their hot chocolate. Again, it's love. It's languid love. It's, we've been outside playing, and now let's sit and have some hot chocolate. And it stays pretty languid until somebody knocks their hot chocolate over, right? And then you got to run and scurry and deal with it. But that's hot chocolate with children. What can we say? It takes a little more focus than it might ordinarily. Well, we have kind of moved into talking about fat and talking about sugar as we are talking about chocolate, since chocolate is more than half fat. And so next week and the week following that, I would like to talk about my favorite fat, and that's butter. Sound like a good idea to you, Gemini?
That sounds wonderful. And Susan, if we could take a moment and let our listeners know where they can find more information and where to order your books as well.
Oh, thanks for asking. Sure. Come and visit me at SusanWeed.com. You can buy my books at wisewomanbookshop.com, as well as, of course, at Amazon. And I have a new site that you might want to visit. It's called wisewomanmentor.com. And there you'll find my regular e-zine, as well as lots of interesting things. And if you decide to become a mentorship student, and you have lots of options for doing that, you will also get to participate in and hear the replays of my monthly teleseminars that I do for my mentorship students, as well as a host of interesting articles and things that I have up there for the students. Thank you so much, Gemini. Green blessings, everyone. Till next week.
Thank you, Susan. This completes the second segment of our two-part series, The History and Medicinal Benefits of Chocolate, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio.